All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you very much for coming today. This is the Center for Biology and Society Conversation Series, and I'm actually going to start us off by just making a few announcements about future events. Coming up on March 26th, there's a bioethics breakfast in which perhaps we can continue the conversation around some of the themes we'll touch on today. It's focused on gene editing, safety, and efficacy, led by Karen Anderson and Bert Jacobs. February 27th is the next Bioethics Breakfast Club, and it will be focused on plant extinction. It will be at the Desert Botanical Garden. And finally, in April, the next iteration of this series, the Conversation Series, will take place. It's a kind of a special one because it will mark the retirement of Charles Perrings. And the focus will be science and the scale of environmental governance. Okay, but today we have I think what's going to be a very interesting and special discussion. We have with us Françoise Baylis, who is University Research Professor at Dalhousie University. She is a internationally known and respected bioethicist, and in my view, one of the most interesting writers for the last several decades in the field of bioethics, both because her scholarship is exceptionally interesting and has extraordinary depth, but also she's been a very powerful public voice in a wide variety of domains and touching on a wide variety of issues, especially over the course of the last few years around the topic that we're going to be discussing today, human genome editing. So she is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Nova Scotia. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, recipient of the Canadian Bioethics Lifetime Achievement Award. She was until recently the Canadian Chair in Bioethics. She was a member of the 2015 Organizing Committee of the First International Summit on Human Genome Editing that was co-organized by the U.S. National Academies, the UK Royal Society, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and she is currently a member of the World Health Organization committee that has a long title that I can never quite remember, but it is in effect on establishing standards for international governance of human genome editing. So not only has Françoise done some of the most interesting writing about this topic, but she's been, over the course of the last 5 years or so, playing an important international role in development of thinking about it and very importantly, public discussion of it. And so the sort of focus of our discussion today, or the occasion for having this gathering, is Françoise's recently published book, which I recommend highly to all of you, Altered Inheritance, CRISPR and the Ethics of Human Genome Editing, published by Harvard University Press. And this book, in addition to being chock full of important ideas, is also, I think, an invitation for the sort of dialogue that I hope we will now participate in. Also with us is Sanghamitra Das, who is a graduate student in biology and society, who is herself doing work which in her own research, which touches upon the issues that we'll be exploring today. And I, by the way, am Ben Hurlbut. I'm an associate professor here in life sciences, and you don't need to know anything about me. Okay, so we are going to run this as a conversation, initially between the three of us, but we will periodically open the floor to interventions from all of you. And if you have a burning question or comment, please catch my eye or raise your hand and wave at me or whatever, because we'd like to make this a collective conversation. But I want to begin this conversation by inviting Françoise to simply say a word to us about what motivated this project. What were you seeking to accomplish with this book? And in particular, what are the sorts of concerns that you draw out in the book that you would like to put on the table for us as matters for collective conversation?
So the idea for this book dates back to February of 2016. So very shortly after the December International Summit in 2015, I had the opportunity to go to the AAAS meeting and to present alongside one of the scientists the work that had been done as part of that sort of 3-day initiative. And it was really clear to me that although there was some agreement between us that there are ways in which the information I thought was being presented and engaged with that really I thought didn't surface some of the important issues. So started thinking about it around that time, February 2016. Didn't actually sign a contract till 2017. Then had a long period struggling with writing this book because my intention from the get-go was to write a book for the general public. And you'll appreciate, any of you who are academics, how difficult that is. Because we have a language that we take as normal and accessible, which is not normal and accessible. We have ways of making assumptions about the background information that our readers already have, and so we don't take time to explain concepts, words, views, values. We often don't even necessarily take time to discuss how we're situated relative to the material, and we try to present a lot of stuff as objective when it's not. So I had a lot of challenges, and I struggled with writing the book because although I've said to you that I really wanted this to be accessible to the public, I also wanted it to be credible, and I wanted my peers not to think that this was just schlock that she was doing on the side. And that actually is really difficult, right? You're trying to make sure that you're meeting the standards of your discipline, and at the same time that you're making things accessible. And what I want to say is that this became really focused for me around the section on the science and how was I going to explain the technology of CRISPR when at some level I genuinely believe you don't need to understand a lot of the science in order to engage with the social, ethical, and political issues. I think it's very good if you understand a lot of the science, but I don't actually think it's necessary for the public to become engaged in the conversation. And yet very often what happens is we work in this kind of knowledge deficit model, and the we here is very loose. Some people work with this sort of knowledge deficit model vis-a-vis the general public, assume the public doesn't understand. If only they understood, they would agree with us, etc. And so I felt I needed to put some science in there to empower those who had a genuine interest in understanding the science. I needed to put some science in there so that I would be perceived by scientists as a credible author. I had a lot of, things that I was trying to do there. Anyhow, at the beginning, I put it in the very beginning of the book, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose half my audience. And then I thought, okay, and I rewrote that whole section to make it an appendix, and I was going to have this cute little paragraph that said, and for anybody who's interested in science, turn to a little bit of science section at the back of the book. And in the end, if any of you do get a chance to read it, you'll see the science turns up on about page 50. And I'm giving you that just as one little example of the kind of way I struggled in writing this book. It took a lot longer than I thought. And it comes back to your question about, why did I write the book? I really wrote the book for the general public, and I really wrote the book to change the world. And I say that, and it sounds presumptuous. And I want to step back and just contextualize that, and then maybe, open it up for other people to comment. But I think most people who choose to have a career that's in any way connected to academia, whether you're doing basic science, whether you're doing the humanities or something, you have a vision for the kind of world you want to live in, and you're trying to help move it forward by producing knowledge that will bring us closer to whatever your vision of the world is. And that's what I was trying to do with this book. But there was a time when I was a little more naive. It was kind of at the beginning of my career, and I actually thought I could do that all by myself, right? Like, I'm going to change the world. And I realized I can't do that. And so my mantra over time became to make the powerful care. And then I realized that one of the biggest challenges is to figure out who are the powerful, especially in any kind of a policy context. And if you read the book, that's in part what the book is trying to do. It's trying in different ways to expose who I think are the powerful. And it's also trying to make the general public be amongst the powerful by trying to share information and to make it accessible. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it sort of shows both the complexity of what I perceive to be the goal and the ways in which I tried to develop some strategies and pay attention to some challenges.
Well, maybe you can say just a couple of words about what you see as the core challenges around the technology of human genome editing in particular. What are the forms of empowerment that you think are necessary and why?
I think some of the challenges are for all of us to figure out whether the stories and the images that we have right now that we put under the banner of science fiction really are science fiction, or whether there's some kind of prescient examples in there. So I think that that's a challenge for us to figure out where might this science go. I think another challenge.
Can you give us an example?
Well, I think it's very easy for us to talk about the ways in which this science might be used to improve certain kind of military goals and objectives. And then you'll get a whole conversation around bioterrorism. And a lot of that seems like it's not science fiction when you imagine the ways in which we might manipulate non-human animals. And one of the examples that's often given is mosquitoes and how they might be used to pursue those kinds of goals and objectives. But then you also have people talking about the ways in which we might change the human in order to make them a better combatant. And we have Jennifer Doudna, who keeps telling us about her nightmares about making lots of little Hitlers, which kind of is a bit strange because it seems to then be harkening back to an old conversation about cloning. But I think that would be an example of people not really being sure how the technology might develop, but not making the connection between the technology doesn't develop itself by itself, right? There are humans that are interacting with technology. And I think the other real challenge is, I know, and I assume all of you know, this technology will not be used in isolation, right? This technology will be used with robotics, with artificial intelligence, with all kinds of other interventions. And I actually find that really challenging to imagine what that world might look like if we really are understanding the ways in which the different technologies will work together. And I think that's more challenging than we can ever imagine for two reasons. I don't think anybody in this room could have imagined 10 years ago the way the cell phone controls our life, right? There's our extended mind in our hand. We walk around with it, and it has changed the way we interact, the way we think, the way we behave. And it's just one technology. It's continuing to morph, and it's continuing to take over our lives, but our lives are different. I had my daughter literally say to me, "How did you live without the internet?" And it was a genuine question. Like, she could not understand, how do you do anything without the internet? And yet, we did. We survived thousands of years. So I think that, for me, is one of the really big challenges. What might the world look like? How might this science be used? And I don't think we're even close to having an understanding of it. A colleague of mine once said, and I'm repeating it, Sean McGrath said, "We are the primitives of a new civilization, and we just don't know that yet."
So one of the ways that we sort of tend to draw distinctions, we tend to think about new technologies and their appropriate uses to draw crisp lines between use and misuse. And yes, we'll avoid misuse, but use is what authorizes and justifies the thing. One of the really interesting points that you make in this book is to challenge the distinction between treatment and enhancement, which is a sort of use-misuse distinction in the application of tools of genetic engineering to the human genome. Making changes to make people healthy, to fix disease, that's an acceptable use. Making changes to make people better to enhance them is an unacceptable use. Well, I wonder if you'd say just a little bit about why you want to problematize that distinction and how that relates to the social embeddedness of this technology as you were just describing.
So one of the things I think is really interesting is that we live and manifest a conflict insofar as we say in print and in a number of policy arenas exactly what Ben has said, that treatments are good, enhancements are bad. And yet we actually all believe that enhancement's good. That's why we go to school. That's why we have children and give them piano lessons, because we think it's going to improve their abilities in terms of math. We do a lot of things right now. They just tend to be environmental right now, more so than biological, but we also do biological enhancements for people, and we don't actually think they're problematic. One of the things that I think is interesting is in this particular context, there's a desire to on the part of some, there's a desire to actually shift the conversation from whether we should be using this technology at all in the first place to say that's not the important question, because of course therapies are really good, and the means don't matter. We should use all means at our disposal to pursue any kind of therapeutic goal or objective. The bugaboo, the thing we need to worry about is enhancement. That's the thing that's problematic. And so one of the things that I think is happening is it's an attempt to cast the conversation in a particular way in order to get a green light very quickly to do something that you think you're not going to get much pushback on, and to have problematized something that you know very quickly that once you've gotten through the door here, you'll be able to turn that around on a dime. Because what you'll do after you get through the door on therapy is you'll say, yeah, but this is really not an enhancement, it's a therapy. So you'll redescribe an activity that could have been described as an enhancement as a therapy, and then you'll move beyond that to say, what's the problem with enhancements? We all believe enhancements ultimately are really good. So I actually view it right now as a particular political strategy that some of us in academia have contributed to over the years in terms of writing and introducing this kind of divide between therapy and enhancement. One of the things I'll just say very quickly, I've said, somewhat in jest, but I actually mean it. Everything I know I put in this book. And so I don't know very much more than what's in the book, and yet what's interesting to me is that it is actually my life trajectory. So the whole debate around therapy and enhancement, I wrote a paper as an undergraduate that I still believe. Sorry, no, I was a graduate student. I wrote a paper as a graduate student that I still believe, which was on growth hormone, right? And I said, how is it that we're saying we will offer, growth hormone treatment for this patient, but that for this person it's an enhancement, and the only difference is that this person has an identifiable illness and this person is of short stature because they were genetically predicted to be of short stature given the stature of their parents and their lineage. If the problem you're attending to is we live in a world that's discriminatory towards people of short stature, how does it matter whether you have an underlying illness you can point to or you're genetically healthy? You still have the same world you're trying to navigate. You're still having the same discriminatory behaviors that you're trying to respond to. And so I think, some 30 years later, this is the same issue. The issue is, how do we live together? What's the world we live in? And are we going to respond to social problems by changing our biology rather than really acknowledging, embracing, challenging the social problems?
I found your part about the enhancement and therapy distinction very important. It's something I have been thinking about in relation to my own work. But as far as I understand, and this is a limited understanding, of course, it performs a discursive function. It's like a heuristic tool to kind of do some kind of boundary work, so that we don't spiral into a kind of a scenario where everything is permissible, like you also express in your book. But just as a graduate student who is finding herself in this milieu and having to work through all of these things, even in areas that are not directly related to enhancement, what other mechanisms could there be for us to distinguish between what is acceptable editing of the human genome and what isn't an acceptable editing? I mean, it's a very easy dichotomy to fall back on, the therapy enhancement divide. But once that is problematized, which it has been effectively, what do we fall back on?
So one of the things that I think is problematic is, on the one hand, understanding that it's a heuristic device, but then imbuing it with a kind of robustness that it doesn't have. And I think it also becomes very difficult when we don't have a lot of language to try to deal with the demarcation line that we're trying to describe. So in the book, I try to use the language of health-related and non-health related, because in and of itself, you can have goals and objectives that are non-health related that are still very good and that you want to pursue. So that was sort of a first attempt to at least have different language, because then it would allow you to put different things in those two categories. So if I go back to the example, if I want to say it's health related, both of the examples I gave you with respect to short stature could fit under the health related description. And I make that move by suggesting that we understand that health includes psychological health and well-being. And so therefore being the recipient or the subject of discriminatory practices, being marginalized in society, we understand how that's a threat to your health and well-being. And so I could put something into the same category that under the sort of more traditional demarcation line of treatment and enhancement would be under different categories. So it allows me to move things in different ways by just using different language. And I'm not saying that language is right. Other people can do other work with other language, but it is an invitation to say that if you don't question the ways in which we've organized the world, you're unlikely to see other opportunities for organizing the world differently. I think that one of the things for me that is really important is understanding what assumptions get built into the idea of enhancement and why it is in the abstract that one would think this is problematic. I think there are certain kinds of enhancements that are deeply problematic and others that are not. And for me, what becomes important is what's the goal or objective. In the book, the language that I use around this is pursuit of the common good. And so I'm more interested in assessing or bringing to bear my own values, my own reflections on any kind of proposed activity in terms of the question, how will this promote the common good? How will this help me get closer to my vision of what a good world might be? And it might be certain kinds of treatments, it might be certain kinds of things you call enhancements, but it's about trying to shift the language and to really focus on what's the bigger picture goal or objective. Somebody had their hand up. I don't know. Can we go to the audience?
Yeah, please.
So when you mentioned growth hormone, something clicked in my head, and it occurred to me that in fact the idea of enhancement versus treatment, we're not the first ones to think of that. Think about the Olympic athletes and the fact that there are drugs that they are allowed to take under some circumstances, but not in others, and that they have rules, so they have in fact figured out a way to make a distinction that they consider to be, the proverbial they, to be enforceable. Why can we not look at that as an example for and apply it just to cheating?
Well, I think that that's a really good example, and in the book I actually take up the question of enhancement in the context of sport and athleticism. And what's interesting there is, what's your perspective going to be when you come to that discussion? So are you a person who's worried about cheating and the fact that now we're going to have unfair competition? Or are you a person who's worried about what are the health consequences of forcing / encouraging our elite athletes to do things to their bodies for our entertainment as we go to watch this sort of gladiator type event? Or if you don't want to think about it as a gladiator event, you can think about it as a political activity where nations get to sort of fight through their elite athletes rather than through other means, et cetera. So there's what becomes really important is what's the lens you want to bring to that activity, right? And you can then say it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, what have you. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting and important about that, especially if we look at sport, are the ways in which we've worried both about the gene and the environment. And that's one of the things that I also try to talk about in the book. There's sort of a lot of genetic essentialism in a lot of our conversations, and in places, you know, it becomes a useful heuristic, so you kind of go along with that conversation. But it's really important to pull back and to appreciate it. So in the context of sport, we have been deeply committed to environmental enhancements. And then every now and then we pull back. So 20 years ago, we were worried about the swimsuits, right? And how that was shaving all this time off of the, times. And now it's the Vaporfly shoes. And it could be something else. And I mean, I spent 9 years on the board of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. I could tell you about all kinds of interesting ways in which cheating takes place. But the interesting thing is it's the frame of reference. What are you worried about? Are you worried about cheating? Are you worried about people's health? Are you worried about, what will or will not count as entertainment? And they're all very different and important things, right? Like, I mean, it's not really entertaining if at some point everybody's been given exactly the same, set of drugs, everybody's been given exactly the same thing, and then you figure, well, what was it? Was it the coaching that made the difference? Was it, that this person's a genetic freak and they actually have some other gene that we just didn't identify yet? But if you actually made them all equal to be equally fair in one sense, you no longer have a competition. So that's the entertainment part. So lots of different ways of looking at the exact same thing. But no, it's not new.
The concept of blurring the line between therapy and enhancement is really interesting. What do you think about dealing with accessibility first? So you have the concept of, this technology being available and permissible because of these reasons. Well, what if when that is addressed first, and the accessibility isn't addressed? What if it becomes cost prohibitive for all people to be able to afford this?
Right.
Some stature could, like, would it then be something to focus on the accessibility before you focus on learning?
Right. So that's a very important point, and a lot of people who are engaged in the debate around the ethics of this technology make the point that it will not be accessible to the masses. And that's absolutely true. Many people will also then go further and make the point that this is going to exacerbate a divide that already exists. And other people will say, well, yes, so it's not a problem. That divide already exists. But we know that that divide is, I think, on a path to reaching a critical point. Right now, we have normalized the language of the 1%, right? Like when I was, a kid, if you said 1%, I would have thought, okay, we're talking mathematically about something, but what? But when I say now, the 1%, everybody knows I'm talking about an elite group. And just to be clear, most of us are part of that 1% if we think about it globally. I know I don't feel like that 1% when we're talking about it, but in another way, we are part of the 1%. So it also becomes interesting, what's your frame of reference when you think about it? So what's interesting is many people have said, look, this technology in and of itself is not a problem. If everybody has it, then it's great, because you're not going to be contributing to these kinds of huge social divides. But that's such an unrealistic hope. And I say that being very sensitive to the fact that I'm from Canada. We have a Canadian-funded healthcare system. I lived and worked in the United States for several years, and literally, I would be invited to come and speak about the Canadian healthcare system, and then the audience, that was mostly American, would tell me that I'm wrong, that I don't understand how the Canadian healthcare system works, that I'm a communist, and the list goes on. And so, already it's really challenging to think about, gee, if you can't even understand what a common commitment would be to provide healthcare for survival, how are you ever going to commit to the kinds of opportunities for enhancement such that we could all be part of a level playing field? So one of the things that's interesting is this debate is very much axed on questions of accessibility. Some people believe it won't be a problem, we'll just make it accessible to everybody. And I'm saying, never mind enhancements, you're never even going to get to treatment being accessible to everybody. And let me add one thing to that. I've said I'm a Canadian, we have a government-funded healthcare system, and so I'm already coming from a different set of assumptions about what we should make publicly available. But let me be very clear, even in my government-funded healthcare system, we will never make this technology available to all Canadians. So if even those of us who've made the commitment, in one sense, have done it, we're not going to do it for this. And we already have good evidence for that in terms of past interventions that are in the $1 million range. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at making interventions in the $1 million range. And so we need to come to terms with the fact that if it goes forward, this is for the elites. This is for the 1%, whether that is a 1% that includes us or not. And we have to think clearly then about what it means to embrace, endorse a technology that will allow people with privilege to entrench that privilege in their DNA, because that to me is what CRISPR ultimately would be about. So we're not going to have just socioeconomic types of privileges, et cetera. We're going to now allow those people to ensure that they have sort of a certain set of biological advantages that would not otherwise be available. And I think that's a very real concern, and it's in that context that people talk about the bifurcation of society into the haves and the have-nots, and depending on who you read or quote, it's the valids and the invalids, or the invalids, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And I think that is a real concern. Now, at another level, you could think, no, that's just evolution, and ultimately it'll only be the 1% that are around anyways, and so why does it matter?
I have a follow-up to that question, which is an excellent question, and I think it figures very much in your book. And but I would like to take a step back and analyze this genetic have and have-nots dichotomy. In this entire discourse, of course, we're talking about development of technology, and the question of accessibility is very important. But also, there are a lot, like our genome is a collective good that belongs to the entire globe. So most of these conversations, they happen in the global north. the voices of the global south are very redacted or missing in some ways. And you and I have attended a conference in India, and we would know from that that the conversation is of a different kind in the global south. What would you say about, like, we are treating the technology as if it is inevitable, but there may be voices in the global south that question the premises of this very technology and ask, like, who is this technology for? How would we accommodate those voices?
So I think you're raising a very important question, and it is a question where I'm doing still a phenomenal amount of learning, and part of that learning comes through the privilege of being a member of the WHO committee that is looking at governance. And part of the reason there is I can tell you that that is a committee that constantly is asking questions about how to understand this technology as it pertains to the goals, objectives, priorities, abilities of low, middle, and high-income countries. And I have never been a party to any kind of meeting where that is a constant issue. And what's interesting is those questions are not only being asked with respect to who will be the beneficiaries of this technology, but it is also being asked in terms of a couple of, I think, really interesting and important ethical issues. So one of them is the question of ethics dumping. So we might be in a context where this is not a priority, and we're not interested in investing resources, time, and talent in the science, and yet we might be stuck having to invest resources in the policy making so as not to become a dumping ground for other people's work. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, how you might bear the consequences of decisions made elsewhere that have nothing to do with your goals and objectives. Now, again, it's not new or unique, but there's a worry about how it might play out in this particular arena. I think the other thing that's really interesting in this context is really asking questions about how even science, which might be aimed at certain kinds of therapeutic goals and objectives, might be perceived differently. So the next meeting of the WHO committee is in South Africa, and a whole day is being devoted to conversation with both scientists and patient groups concerned about sickle cell disease. And I, for one, think it's really important that we're having that conversation in the African continent, where it's an issue, even though it's also an issue here for the African American community. I expect and believe those conversations would be very different just based on the locale and based on the people then who get to participate in those conversations. So at least in terms of the work I'm involved in, I remain deeply committed to broadening the base of people who get to partake in the conversation and get to hopefully influence the ways in which that conversation will go forward. But I'm also not so naive as to think that many of the power brokers are not in the global south. And so the question is, how do you try to attend to that?
Let me ask you a question that builds on this. So in the first few minutes of our discussion, the first person plural was used frequently in an unqualified way, which is something that happens in these kinds of conversations. And yet, what you just said points to the fact that that first person plural is often a particular first person plural. So you, at first with your work with the First International Summit and now with the World Health Organization, are on small committees that are standing in for everybody in some sense, or at least aspiring to do so. I wonder if you'd say something about what you have, I know, been a voice of challenge and even dissent in too quick moves to speak on behalf of everybody without actually eliciting everybody's input. So I wonder if you'd say something about the sort of challenges of that process of undertaking this sort of process of ethical discernment where we're dealing with a human issue, a global issue. And also maybe tell us some stories about the politics of how particular perspectives and priorities and frames and so forth have gotten elevated over others or displaced others. Maybe you want to comment in particular on this very problematic concept of consensus.
Wow, there's a lot in there. So I'm gonna go off on a couple of different tangents and redirect me if you need to. I think that anybody who is interested in doing policy work, and I'll talk about it in the areas of sciences because I think that's what we're here, you make decisions constantly about how much you're going to work on the inside and how much you're going to work on the outside. And I will tell you that working on the inside is not a lot of fun. It may seem like a lot of fun, and it may be for some people. So maybe this is just a very personal narrative. Working on the inside is not often a lot of fun, because you take slings and arrows on the inside and you take slings and arrows on the outside. You've never done enough for the people that you consider your allies on the outside, and you're just a pain for the people who don't think of you as an ally on the inside. I've chosen to do that work, and I've done that in a number of occasions, and sometimes I've actually had to walk away. So sometimes being on the inside has just been too hard and too painful, and I have walked away from doing that. One of the ways in which I try to do that is I try to still keep all of the conversations open, so that even though I've described it as the inside and the outside, is that I see those as workplaces. I don't see those as allegiances, because my allegiance is to a bigger idea, and it's this idea of the common good. So that's what I'm struggling to work towards. I certainly am interested in other people's ideas about the common good, so I'm always interrogating what that means, but it's an orientation. So my commitment is to an orientation rather than to any individual people's or their particular priorities, goals, and objectives, unless I see them as sort of in some sense committed to this. I will give you a really kind of concrete example in terms of how things have played out. And I think it's actually quite interesting, and this is nothing that's not in the public domain that people can't find, but often there's lots of things in the public domain that people don't see until people pull the threads together for them and say, gee, look at this, isn't this interesting? So one of the things that is just a fact of the matter is that I was invited to participate in the organizing committee for the 2015 First International Summit on Human Genome Editing. And for those of you who haven't been following this particular story, it really comes about because in April of that year, 2015, a scientist in China published work that had been done that involved the genetic manipulation of non-viable embryos. Non-viable embryos are embryos that are often used in the context of embryo research. They are embryos that many people would argue don't have moral status because they don't even have the potentiality to go on and to become humans, etc. Regardless of your views about whether or not you should be doing this kind of work, it was not illegal in his country to do research involving the human embryo, and it's not illegal in a number of countries to do that. However, this was responded to as outrageous. And the thing that's particularly interesting is that the response that this was outrageous actually came from researchers in the United States. And I say this only because people should be thinking about the politics of research and how research happens and who's supposed to be first at doing whatever, and how we have a kind of competition in science that's sometimes, to me, not that different than in sport or other kinds of arenas. What's important is, and the reason I mention that is because this scientist, when he tried to get it published, submitted it to what would be called the premier high-impact journals, Nature and Science. It was not accepted by Nature and Science, and so it shows up in a less well-known journal called Protein and Cell. But American authors offer commentaries, opinions on whether or not we should be doing this kind of germline genome editing work in both Nature and Science prior to the actual science paper being published. Okay? So one of the reasons I'm giving you all that detail is for those of you who actually have an interest just in the politics of science, you should go and look at who are the authors of these two papers. You should then look at how many of the authors of these two papers end up on the organizing committee. And it's not even here really the number that matters, it's the names, right? So if what I'm saying to you is you're trying to figure out where power lies, how do you find out where power lies? So you need to know who wrote these articles, you need to know who ends up on this committee, and then of course you should have a question mark, how did I end up on this committee? And I can't actually even answer that question for you. But what's interesting is that the committee is 12 people. 10 of those 12 people are scientists. 2 of them are non-scientists. Of those 12 people, 3 of them are women. The others are men, in case you wanted to know. And of those 3 who are women, 1 is a scientist. So what does that tell you? I'm saying that because, again, if one of your areas of interest is power, you need to think about how gender works. You need to think about how disciplines work in terms of the distribution of power. One of the things that's interesting then is you can go and look at the membership of the 2015 International Summit. And at the end of that summit, with respect to this area of science, the conclusion was, if you're doing basic research in the lab, which is what this scientist was doing, it's great, go ahead, fill your boots. If what you want to do is to take those same genetically manipulated embryos and put them into a human being, that's a problem. You shouldn't do it right now. The language that gets used is irresponsible. It would be irresponsible to do this unless you've got, in the future, safety and efficacy and broad societal consensus. And for anybody who knows anything about ethics, that's a two-part ethics framework. It's really simple, and yet it's deeply complicated. I don't want to go into that now, but I want you to hold on to that idea, because then in 2018 we have the second international summit. And what's interesting is that that summit is not taking place because some scientist somewhere in the world has done something that other scientists are responding to. They're just having this 3 years later because the science supposedly has changed so much, improved so much, that we need to have a new look at the science and the ethics. And that's the context in which that meeting has taken place. And I am not invited to be on the organizing committee of that meeting, but you should look and compare the membership of the two committees and see the names that carry over from 2015 to 2018, because some people were both on the 2015 committee and on the 2018 committee. And what becomes really important is that the conclusion of that committee at the end, and this is now a meeting that has been, I could say hijacked, I don't know that that's the right word, but it's certainly been taken over by events, which is that another Chinese scientist has announced to the world that he has, in fact, done this research in the lab, transferred those genetically modified embryos to a human, and twins have been born. So in 2015, somebody manipulates non-viable embryos, and the committee says, wait a second, you can't do this, safety and efficacy, broad societal consensus. 2018, 3 years later, oh, we've got babies. We need a translational pathway forward. So that's the conclusion after we've actually done something that, in the abstract, most people would have thought was more egregious than what happened in 2015. So again, if you're interested in power, you need to look at the names. Who's arguing for that?
Just where a translational pathway means laying out the steps to do this responsibly, to
right.
Bring it into clinical.
It's a roadmap. We need a better roadmap to how to do this. And then the last thing I'm going to say, and I mean, the work is continuing, but the last piece I want to give you, again, because if you're just interested in, I mean, you can think of CRISPR and genome editing really as just an illustration of something that's really interesting and important. That's why I'm giving you all the details, because I realize not everybody here is interested in genome editing, but the point about how do you make policy and how does power move, I think is a generic issue or concern. So what I think is also then important for you to look at if you're interested is there's a Nature article that comes out in March of 2019, so this is after the 2018 summit, and they are now calling, and I am a member of the group of authors there, explicitly calling for a moratorium. And what I would ask you to do is to look at who was on the 2015 that does not end up in 2018, but that appears again in 2019. And therefore making clear that the wording and the language of what happened in 2015 was actually very important, because it allowed everybody to sign on, but when push came to shove and people had to line up, they lined up very differently. And what really then becomes important is this idea of a moratorium. And what's interesting, and again, I think this applies to science policy writ large, in this arena, people keep pointing to Asilomar, and isn't that great, and responsible science. And then some people think a moratorium here would be that kind of an event, and so they think of it as posturing, or other negative words have been applied that I won't repeat. But I think what's worth thinking about here is, why are some people committed to a moratorium, and why are some scientists objecting to it? And again, just under the theme of power, right now this is an area of science where it's broadly thought that there are 3 scientists who are amongst the pioneers. There are more, but there are 3 that are widely acknowledged in that context. 2 of them signed the call for a moratorium, 1 of them did not. So if you think about it again, just in terms of history, how things might have played out differently if all 3 of those scientists had lined up and said, we're all calling for a moratorium. So one of the things that becomes really, really important in any area of science is to pay attention to who is where, what they're saying, and where they're willing to be counted in terms of, the politics of what's going on. So I don't know if that's a bit of a long-winded answer. I don't know if I answered all the points that you had in your original comment.
I'm really enjoying this conversation. It's a lot of fascinating directions to go. I want to go all the way back to when you started saying enhancement and treatment, ask a question about, because I think the way I thought about enhancement versus treatment was relative to the mean, median, or any other measure of the distribution for the population. And you said if I was short, which I am, I could consider that enhancement. I consider that a treatment, right? Because I would say I'm one standard deviation below the typical height, just like your. Thank you, Jason. He has said that in many faculty meetings. Just like someone with sickle cell anemia is one standard deviation below the oxygen binding capacity, right, in their blood. So, like, if we really want to abstract it, is that how you view it, or that didn't sound like how you viewed it? It sounded like it would be enhancement because height's not something I need to have.
No, I think I'm saying exactly the opposite. So let me restate it to make sure that I'm clear. What I'm saying is that if you are of short stature and you would like to be brought up to the norm, I think that you can call it enhancement, you can call it treatment, but that's not the issue. So some people out there in the world will say, yes, of course it's an enhancement. Other people will say, how can it be an enhancement? It's a treatment. We want to bring them up to the norm. Sure. But they'll say, but bringing up to the norm, that's to enhance, that's to improve.
And semantics. So you're saying there's no standard definition for this. It's argued in either way.
No, I'm saying it becomes relative to the goal that you're trying to pursue. And I said that's why I'm trying to say I understand how that language works in the world, and if you're sophisticated enough linguistically, you can make it go either way. And so why not just call it what you want to call it? And so I tried to offer new language around, which is cumbersome, right? A health-related or non-health related, and not everybody necessarily knows what it means, but I'm saying that's the goal. So if I want to change my body shape to look like the cat woman, do you want to call that a treatment or an enhancement? Well, you could try to use that language and say it's definitely an enhancement, but you could also then say, but it's just non-health related. She's just, or you could say, well, actually, no, she's psychologically distressed by not having the body of a cat, right, or what have you. So part of what I'm trying to do is to say, let's not rely on language which brings with it a whole bunch of baggage and a whole bunch of assumptions where we think we know what we're talking about. And let's say, why do we want to do that? And if you say to me, look, I've been traumatized my whole life. I've not gotten these jobs that I would have had but for this discrimination, and I would like to be 2 inches taller, or I'd like to make sure my children are 2 inches taller, I want to say, well, gee, like, is that a good thing to want to respond to that? To want to respond to somebody who's saying, I'm living a painful life, I'm experiencing discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sympathetic to those claims. I'm wanting to say, like, why do I need to call it treatment or enhancement? I just want this person to have a better life. And so it's a way of trying to say, can we have different kinds of conversations which will expose what it is we're pursuing and what it is we're trying to achieve. And I just think that very often, we live in a world that relies on categories to mean things. Like if I tell you I'm a socialist, I'm a communist, I'm a liberal, I tell you if I lived in this country, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, what are all the assumptions you bring about me instead of just dealing with me, right? And trying to figure out what do I think and or believe about whatever.
We should probably also model the consequences of each decision, because if we all did this, we just pick another trait besides height to bias a choice against each other for, right? We would find something else, right? Height's just the obvious one that we can use.
Right, and if I can, I just want to...
Your beard, right?
If I can...
Beard, this is definitely be fine.
Yeah, if I can, I just want to say one more thing about this whole treatment and enhancement divide. It becomes particularly important in this arena if we focus on whether we're talking about making somatic changes or germline changes. And that's something that hasn't really surfaced in the conversation yet, so I just want to make sure that everybody appreciates that. When we're talking about making somatic changes, we're talking about making changes to our body cells, all of the cells in our body, not our reproductive cells. And typically when people are talking about the divide between therapy and enhancement, they're imagining persons, patients in the world out there that we would be engaging with. The important thing about the work that's seen to be controversial, and I say seen to be controversial because I actually think there's a lot of work around the somatic stuff that's also controversial, but we're not paying attention to it right now, but that is seen to be controversial with manipulating the germ cells, and there you're manipulating your gametes, so your egg, your sperm, the early embryo, the precursors that make the egg and sperm, et cetera, is that you're actually not treating people that exist in the world. You're manipulating tissue in a dish in order to create a particular kind of being that has traits that you think are good. Now, some people are saying it's a treatment if the manipulations you're making are to try to ensure that this embryo will go on to become a fetus and a child without a disease. But that's a very different project from treating a person with a disease. So in that context, I think it really does start muddying the water, because we're actually, I would argue in that context, even applying the word treatment inappropriately. You're not treating an embryo by just making sure that you've modified it so that a different being will come into existence. That's not a treatment. So it's really interesting how the language can play out.
Sorry, okay, sure. Go ahead.
So I was actually kind of had a question about what you sort of started talking about, because I noticed how you used the example of like, oh, what if the person wants to change their height? But once they're done growing, a person can't even change their height or another physical characteristics. We know through genetic manipulation, because their whole body has the genes that they have. Because that seems ethically also relevant, because when you're talking about like treatment or enhancement or whatnot, what if most of these things they can't be done to an adult individual, they can only be done to their future offspring, and they can only like edit, the embryo to make sure that their child grows up, to a particular way, but they themselves can't do anything. It's only being done to those in wide existence.
Right. So in part, this brings me back to one of the earlier comments I made about, the struggle to sort of deal with science fiction and reality and things like that. So one of the things I haven't been clear or specific about is that right now, even the way we imagine this technology, we're looking at single gene disorders. We're ignoring all the environmental impacts. So there's a lot of, that's been stripped away that's actual reality that makes things a lot more complicated, granted. However, when it comes to this idea about what can or can't be done in terms of somatic interventions for patients or persons, depending on whether you're thinking health-related, non-health-related, is you could be looking at making changes either in vitro or in vivo and actually just targeting certain kinds of cells or tissues, right? So height is used as an example in the book just to be able to make the difference, to make this point. But there are other ways in which you can imagine making changes to a living person that would have those kinds of life-changing or altering effects. One of the examples I talk about in the book is Huntington's, which is a single gene disorder, which if in theory you were to go after it, you could. Sickle cell disease, which I've alluded to as well. So there are places in which it could be done without saying, oh, the only way I could address this is to do it in my progeny. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to say, I also said on a couple of occasions, and I really want to emphasize that here, is that to me, CRISPR right now is really just an example of, I think, much bigger issues that are of interest, both politically, ethically, socially. And the interesting thing is you could look at what came before it, which is TALENs or zinc finger. You can look at what's going to come after it, which is base editing, et cetera. And so we've got a moment in time where people are kind of interested and excited about this, partly spurred by most recently the birth of twins that are gene edited, but since then other scientists coming along saying, hey, I too am going to do this, I'm just going to do it better than he did it, right? And so I think there is the prospect of both happening, but it is this kind of realm of what's real, what's not real. I do think that one of the things you're hinting at that I do just want to offer up a quick comment, and then we'll go back to the audience, is I am amongst the people who believe you have no right to have children. And that's controversial for some people because they do assert that there is a right to have children. And I say, yeah, really, where'd it come from? Like, what's it grounded in? And then people will refer to some international documents which talk about the right to found a family. But if you actually know those documents and you know where they come from, it's not actually about the right for you biologically to use your genetic material to have children. And I think what's really interesting is that ultimately the people who are defending the use of this technology, when push comes to shove, that's the only argument they have for why it should be pursued in the next generation. It's the claim that there are people in the world who, because of their genetic status and because of the person with whom they wish to have children, so they don't want to get rid of that partner and find another partner, or they don't want to use donated gametes, but because they are committed to, I want to use my genetic material and I want to use that person's genetic material, and between the two of us, we cannot have healthy children. Therefore, you have an obligation to make sure that I have access to this technology. It's not an argument that I find persuasive. And I talk a lot about that in the book because science is, in some sense, a public good. I say in some sense because it gets complicated depending on who's funding it, et cetera. But especially if you think about all the time and talent that gets invested in science, we do have to look at opportunity costs. And this is an area where I think that's a really big issue.
So I wanted to pick up on this question of what's the lens, what are we trying to do? And also Ben's point about consensus, because we have a lot of different problems that are now global, and this is one of them. We could look at biodiversity as another one.
Yep.
And then there's a question of, well, if we're going to do something on a global scale, what do we do first? The move that I often see is, first we try and find consensus. First we try and find maybe the common good. But a counter move there would be, first we need to invest in local goods. Or first we need to figure out what we're trying to do regionally or locally better, because that's where the global scale is recently constructed, right, and has relatively weak power when it comes to nation states and people's everyday lives. So can you comment on why start with consensus?
Yeah.
And is the common good a useful fiction in this regard, or a reality, or a red herring?
Okay, so lots of things that I'd like to say in response. So first of all, I think the common good is a real thing. So I need clean air, you need clean air, everybody on this planet needs clean air. And if you fix the air in your area, whatever you think that means, I don't know how you're going to protect your air in your area. Like, it's a global issue. We all need clean air. We all need clean water. We all need not to be blown up in some nuclear disaster, et cetera. So I think there are such things as the common good, and I think that I can point to them. I think what's potentially controversial is my attempt to include the human genome in that list of common goods. So that I take, yes, I can understand why that's controversial, but the other stuff that we kind of all need to survive, I don't know how you can solve that locally. I know how you can do things that will make things better locally, but you can't put up walls around your air. You cannot put up walls, well, maybe you can around your water, I don't know. But so that's the first kind of response. I do think there are things that are the common good, and we can argue about what things are in there. I think, light, sunshine, that's a common good, right? I don't want you to sort of think that it belongs to you and you're going to look after it somehow. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think consensus building is really important. Why? Because it forces you to have different conversations. It forces you to look around at the people that you have to take into consideration, right? And so hopefully you don't get just to be in your bubble. You don't get to just be 12 people, right? You have to say, I can't actually represent any of the voices in the world because I haven't lived that experience. I value experiential knowledge tremendously, not just, academic expertise. And if I don't have that lived experience, I don't understand what those issues are. I think, for example, if we think about what happened with GMOs, I think if you'd had a lot more public conversation, you would have had a very different response to GMOs. Generally, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Why? Because I don't think people paid attention to what humans were actually concerned about, and that's a really good example of where it was easy to kind of use the knowledge deficit model. Oh, people don't understand anything about genes. They're worried about the tomato gene and the, the canola gene skipping, and that's not what all people were concerned about. They were concerned about the impact on little farmers, on what's agribusiness going to be doing, how's it going to change socially, our interactions with the land. You have indigenous perspectives on whether or not you can cultivate the land in this way, rape the land in there, in some languages. You have concerns about what's the variety of tomatoes that'll be available to me in the store. Well, if you don't talk to people, how do you know what are all the things that are getting them exercised, and how can you engage properly and respectfully and answer? You're absolutely right. This is not the only global challenge we have, and in many ways, I would say to you, it's one that right now does not have the attention of the world in the way that, say, climate does. So if I say, gee, people should be worried about what's going to happen potentially to their genome, and they say, I'm trying to put food on the table, right? Like, I really don't care about what might or might not be happening to the human genome. I get that, and I'm sympathetic to that. But there's a part of me that also wants to say back, yeah, but you know what? If you ever do manage to get food on the table and your kids are surviving, don't you want to worry about the world they're surviving into? And then I do want to pay attention to both gene and environment. So I want to worry about what's happening to the environment, and I want to worry about what's happening to the gene. And especially in this context, in where I do in the book engage in a little bit of science fiction, I say, one of the problems with this technology is you're just racing ahead. And then I want to say, and what do you think ahead is? Like, let's get back. Like, you're racing where? And CRISPR is ultimately a design project, and I say, okay, so what are you designing for? Are you designing so that we can live on this polluted planet? Or are you designing so that we can get off this planet and live in a starship? Like, what are you designing for? Because that's the critical thing here. We've always been able to do some work around selection, And depending on how you want to use the word design, you could say we've been doing design, right? Like when I pick my sexual partner, maybe I'm doing a design project in terms of what I imagine the progeny will be. But this is a design project of a different kind, right? And so if you're going to do that, like, don't you have to know what you're designing for? And it's just this thing like, I got really cool science and I can use it. And honestly, like very often when I hear the arguments around this, that's what I'm hearing. It's really cool science. I want to use it. And you know, they're mostly nice people, and they say things like, I want to help people, like that's what I want to do, I want to use it to help people. But you don't see sort of a robust understanding of where it is they think progress is situated. The last thing I want to say, just because I am deeply committed to broad societal consensus, is two things. I don't know how to do it, okay? But I'll tell you this much. I know the companies, whether it's, you know, CRISPR Therapeutics or Editas or whatever, these companies are investing hundreds of millions of dollars a year on the science. And I'm thinking, why don't you invest hundreds of millions of dollars a year on human psychology and us understanding how to have conversations at a global level? It's hard science. I don't know how to do it. In the area of climate, there are people that are experimenting. One of the experiments is called Worldwide Views. You can look it up on the internet. These are people that are trying to see how can we start a conversation. There's all kinds of people that are real techies. Like, there's a solution out there, right? I don't know what it is. I don't know how to do it. I probably can't even imagine it. But that doesn't lead inevitably to the conclusion it's not worth doing. It's not worth trying. And the bottom line is that if we try, we may never achieve it, but we will change the conversation. Different people will get to be involved, different ideas will be on the table, and so hopefully we'll get to make better decisions about something.
So our time is up. In fact, we're even a little bit past it. So unfortunately, I have to call this conversation to a close. But I think this is actually a very good note to end on, because as everybody, I'm sure, in the room is aware, we have scratched the surface of a deep and complex issue. But I think Francois's project in this book and what she said today invites us to continue that conversation. I hope you'll do it by reading your book, by talking with others about it, and with taking ideas that have been shared here and continuing with them. So with that, let's thank Francoise for a really wonderful session.
Thank you.